Alright, welcome back. So, in this video, we're going to now talk about the concept of short-term memory and long-term memory, right? And we're also going to talk about deep charging. So, we are going to combine the next two sections in the book. So, basically, we're going to talk about a way of dividing the subconscious up on the basis of the behavior of passive memory. Right, so we basically were talking about how subconscious memory, of course, it stores energy in it. It stores energy in the form of association, and excuse me, it stores energy in the form of association, and when that it's always associated with some subject, and when you're not focusing on the subject, the subconscious memory goes into a passive state. Right now, what we didn't actually what we alluded to last video but didn't really explicitly state was a very interesting fact, right? And so this first point here says all positive memories impact the conscious mind simultaneously. And so what do I mean by that? Basically just meaning that when we're talking about your mood, right? So your mood is basically the effect of passive memory, right? So when subconscious memory goes into a passive memory state or a passive state, right, it's still compelling you at a subconscious level, right? It's much weaker, but it is still compelling you. It's weaker than when it's in an active state. But when we talk about your mood, we talk about the ambient compulsion, which we refer to by your mood. We don't need to specify which specific memory your mood is coming from. Why is that? Right? Because it's coming from all of them. Right, so when we're talking about charging, right, we have to specify the subconscious memory because we didn't really talk about it that much. We talk about it in the next video, in the next chapter when we actually talk about charging. But we did allude to it, right? So I said that when you're focused on, your subconscious memory can only charge when it's in an active state, right? So when you're focused on the subject associated with it. It cannot charge in a passive state. In fact, it discharges. It can only discharge when it's in a passive state, right? So when we're talking about active memory, we have to refer to which subject, when we're talking about charging the subconscious, we have to refer to which subject your attention is focused on. But when we're talking about your mood with passive memory, we don't have to make any reference to the subject or whatever, right? Why? Because just as this point says, every single passive memory you have, right, is compelling you at a subconscious level, right? So, and remember what I said, your subconscious mind is storing every single experience you have, presumably since the time you were born, right? It's been doing that. It's been storing every single memory, every single experience to some subconscious memory, and it has organized the memory of those experiences on the basis of the things you are focused on, right? So, if this is correct, right, then you can almost interpret it as meaning, consequentially, that every single experience you have should have some subconscious memory associated with it, and they should all be compelling you right now because all passive memories impact this conscious mind simultaneously, right? So in other words, since right now I'm not thinking of every experience I've ever had, right, then those experiences are stored in some subconscious memory somewhere in my subconscious mind. And they're in a passive state because I'm not thinking about them. But they should at the same time be compelling me. So does that sound right? Does it sound right to say that your mood, right, is a reflection of everything you've ever experienced at the same time? Well, that doesn't really sound right. But then we have to remind ourselves of something else I said about passive memory. So I said that passive memory ages out, right? So majority of its energy is gone as long as it stays within the passive state up to 7 days, right? Doesn't matter how many times you did focus on that, the subject associated with the passive memory. Doesn't matter really how many times it's been in an active state within 7 days. As long as it's the moment it goes 7 full days, right? It actually does matter how long it's been in active state in its last 7 days. But for what I'm talking about right now, because what I'm going to talk about in a moment, it matters. But for what I'm talking about right now, as long as it's 7 days has elapsed, right, for the total amount of time it's been in the passive state, right, it'll lose all of its energy and then it'll age out. So when it ages out, then it doesn't have enough energy to impact your mood in a significant way, nor does it help or boost or dampen your charge in any significant way. So what this means is that it allows us to talk about subconscious memory in a very interesting way, right? So we can basically distinguish between memories that do have energy and are impacting your mood and the memories that don't, right? Because there's like basically a countless number of memories that don't, which is basically all the memories you've ever had in your entire life that reflect your entire life. But there's only a few memories in comparison that have been active in the last 7 calendar days, right? So they've been active in the last 7 calendar days. And those would be the ones that actually have some degree of energy, at least enough to impact your mood because they haven't aged out yet. So we could basically split the entire system of subconscious memories, right, all of them, into 2 categories based on which ones have aged out and which ones haven't. So just to go over, I think we already went over this, but just to read it. So the aging out process allows us to make a meaningful distinction between memory that's been in a active state in the last 7 days and every other memory. So that's what I just said. So, and just to before I go over this point, basically what I'm getting at is we're going to go over what these 2 terms mean: short-term memory, long-term memory. So when I was studying all this and getting used to these ideas, as I'm realizing what's going on, as I'm charging subconscious energy, I found it useful to start breaking up subconscious memories that have energy into a category that I call short-term memory, right? And I started talking about my subconscious memories that I recognized didn't have any energy, which aged out, right, into a category I call long-term memory, right? So I break up your subconscious memory into those 2 categories, right? Now, short-term memory is not referring to physical memory, right, which is just your brain's ability to charge your subconscious to recall past events, right? Because that's still a subconscious action, right? That's a compulsion or a form of altered perception. I feel like that frequency doesn't really have an emotion associated with it, when I think about it, but it is still it's a altered form of perception that requires a subconscious charge. Now your brain charges your subconscious, the ground state, to do that, and it does it in 2 ways in terms of short-term memory and long-term memory. But that's not what I'm talking about here. That's why here I call it short-term subconscious memory. And then there's a long-term subconscious memory. But I may just use the term short-term memory or long-term memory just to make it shorter. But I'm not talking about the physical brain, the term used in psychology. I'm talking about the subconscious. So to go over this point, which, like, once again, we kind of already said it, but short-term subconscious memory refers to memory that hasn't aged out yet, and long-term memory refers to memory that has aged out. So the reason this is so important is because short-term memory is basically the part of your subconscious memory that contains all the energy, right? So all of that energy has a significant impact on subconscious charging, right? Now remember what we said. Your mood is basically the effect of all of your passive memories that haven't aged out yet. So it's all the passive memories that are in your short-term memory. We haven't said it exactly that way before, but I'm saying that now. But passive memory impacts your mood, and your mood adds energy to every subconscious action you perform while you have that mood. And what that means is that mood basically boosts the strength of every subconscious action you're performing, right? So, in other words, it allows you to charge much faster, right? We're going to talk about that in a moment when we talk about short-term memory and deep charging. But for the moment, I want to talk about long-term memory first. So long-term subconscious memory refers to all the subconscious memories that have aged out, right? So they've been in the passive state, so the total amount of 7 days or longer. So what can we say about passive memory, right? Because basically, every experience you've ever had, if the theory is correct, right, that every experience you've ever had is automatically stored to some subconscious memory, right, then there's some subconscious memories, there's a set of subconscious memories that represent every experience you've ever had your entire life, right? And they're all in your long-term memory, right? But they don't have enough energy to significantly impact your mood in a passive memory state because you're not thinking about any of them right now, right? All those countless number of memories you've had your whole life, you're not thinking about them right now. So they're in a passive memory state. So what can we say about them? Do they have any impact? Is there any meaningful or useful thing to say about them since they're not impacting your mood in any way? Well, there actually is, right? And that's what this point is about. So I say that long-term memory is actually important for learning, right? So what do I mean by that? Where does that analysis come from? Well, the thing, this is something I've noticed about subconscious memory and something I've learned about it, and I'm going to give an analysis related to education theory. But just to give an example, let's go back to the dark alley. So I think I gave the example, if you're in a dark alley, right, and if I'm in, well, I gave the example where I was in a dark alley, say someone robbed me, held me at gunpoint, I feel very traumatized, right, and now if I go home, right, if I take my mind off everything by watching a movie or whatever, I won't feel as bad or as traumatized by the event, right? But I do still feel it a little bit. It hasn't completely gone away. It isn't like if I take my mind off of it, I'll get so caught up in stuff that I'll completely have forgotten that I just got robbed, right? Because the mood is still there. So the subconscious memory that has stored that experience, right, still has a lot of energy. And when I'm not thinking about it, so when I'm watching a movie, that energy, subconscious memory goes into passive state and it impacts my mood, right? So I'll still feel a little bit bad because my mood is a little bit bad, but I'll feel a little bit better watching a movie because the subconscious memory switched to a passive state. And passive memory always has a weaker effect than active memory. Now, when I focus back on that event, right, let's say it just happened, if I focus on the event, I'll feel the trauma more strongly because the subconscious memory switched to an active state. Now, this is all after the event just happened, right? Let's say an hour ago or something. Now, let's say I focus on the memory of that traumatic event 5 years later, right? Well, how will I feel? Because by that time, the subconscious memory has aged out, right? It's been in the passive state more than 7 days, right? So I've gone 7 days off that whole 5 years without thinking about it. So it would have lost all of its energy, right? It's no longer impacting my mood. I don't feel it or remember it at all, right? Until something happens for some reason that causes me to think about that event all those years later, right? All those years earlier again. So when I do think about the traumatic event all these years later, how will I feel? Do I feel anything, right? Do I feel absolutely nothing from the event because all the energy went away? No, right? So you can kind of verify your own experience regarding something like that. If you think about something sort of traumatic that happened to you, maybe when you were a kid, right? When you focus on the event that happened when you were a kid and just kind of play it out and remember it, right? You probably won't just feel good and super happy, right? Because it lost its energy. No, you still feel a little bit bad, but nowhere near as much as you did, obviously, when the event was fresh, right? So what that tells us is something very important. That long-term memory, although it doesn't really have an impact in its passive state, right? So it doesn't affect your mood. You don't notice it. It's not compelling you in a significant way. What is still true is that it does still have an effect in an active state, right? So in other words, if for some reason, right, I think of some memory, however long ago, as long as it's more than 7 days, really, because it ages out after 7 days. If I have some reason, something happens that makes me just randomly think of some experience or some subject some time ago, right, then its corresponding subconscious memory will finally switch to an active state. And when it does, it will still carry a tiny bit or a little bit of energy that I'll be able to feel in an active state. Right? So that's important. Long-term memory doesn't affect you in a passive state, but it still affects you at least a little bit in an active state. So we're talking, and it doesn't matter how long and how old it is, right? It could be when you were a kid. Like I said, if you think about a traumatic event, maybe even when you were 5 or 6 years old, you'll still feel a little bit of the energy stored in that memory. So why do I say long-term memory is important for learning? Well, because we haven't really gone over charging subconscious energy for creativity yet and intelligence, which are really the same thing, right? From the subconscious perspective, intelligence, creativity are exactly the same phenomenon. However, the reason long-term memory is important for learning is because when you're trying to learn something, right? Well, let's say you're trying to learn math, because I tried to learn a lot of math when I was younger. You keep producing an intention, right? And you produce an intention in a very specific way that causes your subconscious to charge, right? It charges in a way that'll compel you to use transcendental intelligence, right? Again, it'll make a little more sense. We're going to talk much more about what's happening there, because that's a longer explanation, and we'll talk about it pretty much all of chapter 13. Not all of it, but, that's a part of it. How the subconscious compels you for the purpose of intelligence or creativity. It's just a more detailed explanation that I didn't want to go over yet. We're going to talk about in chapter 13. However, for now, just know that the subconscious charges in a way which alters your perception in such a way that allows you to process information in a way that we call intelligence or creativity, depending on the circumstance. So when you're trying to learn something, right, you keep producing intention that causes your subconscious to charge and allows you to use transcendental intelligence, right? Now, the reason that's so important for long-term memory is because that transcendental charge for that transcendental intelligence pretty much stays with you forever, right? So, for example, let me give an example of what happened to me, right? So I think I talked about it a little bit earlier in one of the earlier videos. I was talking about my experience studying a lot of math, right? So I studied a lot of math when I graduated high school. So when I was in high school, right? When I was in school before I graduated, I wasn't terrible at math, right? I wasn't really bad at it, but I wasn't great either, right? And I was always good at science. I never had a problem with science, except for earth science for some reason. But other than that, I never had a problem with science since I was a kid. It was always the easiest subject. Barely even gave any effort, right? And I remember in class, I used to get high grades. The teacher would always say something about my high grades in science. It was in chemistry. And then a lot of the kids, they would kind of almost be annoyed because some of them, I don't know, for some reason, a lot of them had trouble with chemistry. And they would always wonder, like, how does he just pass so easily? Because I used to, not come to class a lot, right? But I would just come in and just pass the test. And I used to actually study it a little at home. They didn't realize that. But still, I always had an easy time with science, right? It was never hard for me, with the exception of earth science. But math, right? Math wasn't that hard, but it was just, I wasn't as good at science. Now, when I got out of high school, I started I might tell you the reason why one day. It's not too important now, but I just started studying a whole bunch of math, right? And at first, it was very tricky and it was very difficult. Even the concept of a limit, right, or derivative, right, in calculus was actually hard for me at that time, right? I remember I read this book called Calculus Demystified, right, and it was so hard to understand. And I actually read the book, had terrible reviews, right? But, what did I do? I kept trying to study. I kept producing an intention, right, to figure it out, to make sense of what's going on, what's happening. I was basically teaching myself. And as I kept producing that intention, right, I kept my subconscious, I didn't know, obviously I didn't know this at the time. I was like 19, right, but I was like 19 or 20. But my subconscious kept charging every time I produced that intention to make sense of what I'm seeing in these books, right? Make sense of the math. And eventually what would happen, my subconscious would charge and alter my perception in such a way that allowed me to use transcendental intelligence, right? And so I'd be able to make sense of the math, right? And as I kept studying more and more and more math, right? Calculus 1, Calculus 2, Calculus 3, right? I just kept studying more and more math. Eventually I would enter the zone, right? So that kept happening over and over, right? So when I would study Calculus 1 and it was just derivatives, I couldn't understand what was going on, but I kept producing intention, kept trying to understand it, and then eventually I did. And not only could I understand it, I got in the zone, right? So I would be able to solve problems easily now, right? I could look at the general form of the equation, and they talk about this in pre-calculus, right? If you just look at an equation, you could look at certain components of it and you can kind of model the graph or get a sense of the graph in your head for it, right? But I started being able to do that. I started to be able to look at it and just almost intuitively kind of have a sense of what the solution was going to look like, or the format of this solution, and exact steps I would have to take to solve it. And I could kind of all do it in a 1, 2, 3 process. And then once I got good, maybe let's say with derivatives in that way, I would jump to integration. And then I would do integration, and this is calculus 1. I would do a tiny bit of differential equations. The book I had, they actually had a little bit of differential equations. And then, sometimes I would go back, right, and study derivatives again and kind of keep doing that. And then I would jump to calc 2. And calculus 2 is very much all in integration. Right? So it's just integrating the hardest problems you can imagine, right? Now the funny thing is in science, there's actually harder problems even than that, because they're not problems that are meant to be integrated, right? You'll always get problems that are meant to be integrated in calculus 2, no matter how hard they are. In physics, right, when you're dealing with real world problems, they're not given to you in a nice sort of integrable manner, right? So you got to use other methods to sort of analyze them or approximate their solution, things like that. But anyway, I would study calculus 2, and this integration's tough, right? But I'll keep studying it, right? Same thing with vector calculus, same thing with mathematical physics. And so when I would do that, I would keep entering the zone, right? And I'm solving these problems left and right. But so why that's important is because when I was doing that at the time, I was super in the zone, right? And it allowed me to solve problems like 1, 2, 3. I could solve them in my head, solve them super quick. It'd be no problem, right? But if you put those problems in front of me now, right, it would be a little bit hard for me, right? Because I'm not in the zone like I was before. I haven't studied that stuff in years, right? So I would be very rusty, right? But if I'm super rusty and I don't really remember everything now, would it be the case, right, that I would have as much trouble understanding those concepts as before? Well, no, right? As before, when I was first learning it for the first time. Well, no, right? I would still have a much easier time. Now, you might say, well, of course that's true because of your physical memory, right? Your brain helps you to remember a lot of these concepts. And no, right? That's part of it. That's true. But that's not all of what I'm talking about, right? There's actually an intelligence factor that goes beyond the capabilities of the brain. We'll talk more about that in chapter 13. It'll make more sense. But basically, just think of creativity, right? So if you're very creative, you can charge your subconscious to make jokes very, very easily and practically over and over and over again if you're in the zone, right? Your brain does not have the ability to do that. There is no theory of the brain that can explain your body's ability, your ability to enter the zone with making jokes, right? And that's something science has never been able to explain. We're going to talk about how it actually works in chapter 13, and that's actually part of how I even knew the subconscious was metaphysical, because I would experience this phenomenon, and there was no theory I could think of how the brain could possibly explain that. And so, and another way of putting that is, remember what I said about relationships, right? So, in order for you to perceive a relationship, right, your subconscious has to be on a specific frequency, right? So, for example, if you want to perceive two people as friends, right, that's to perceive that relationship between them is actually a form of altering your perception, right? And so it's altering your perception to perceive something abstract, which is a relationship. So your subconscious has to switch to a frequency to alter your perception to perceive that relationship. If it isn't on that frequency, you can't perceive that relationship. So math works the same exact way, right? Your subconscious has to be on a frequency to alter your perception to perceive a relationship between numbers, right? And if you're not on that frequency, you're not going to be able to perceive that relationship between numbers. What a lot of people actually do when studying math is they just use their negative mind. Now, their negative mind has a very tiny ability to perceive relationships in that way, which comes from your ground state, and that comes from your brain. It's something we've evolved as humans. Our brain is involved to charge our subconscious in that way, but that charge is nowhere near adequate to study for the type of math that we actually learn. Where you could say our species just hasn't evolved yet, right, to charge our subconscious at an intense enough level to solve math like that. But so how do we learn that type of math? Well, we produce an intention which causes our subconscious to charge and alters our perception to perceive the relationships in mathematics, right? Now, when a person doesn't have that charge, they're just using their negative mind. Negative mind can't perceive the relationships well enough to have a good, easy time with math. What people actually do to get around this problem is they will look at a mathematical problem, right? Whether it be a word problem or an equation, right? And they see it has having a certain format, right? So they'll know this number represents this number represents this number represents this. And they'll just memorize what steps they have to take, like a computer, right? A computer can just solve a problem using some algorithm without actually having any knowledge of how the problem actually works, right? A computer's not alive, right? So it has no actual knowledge of anything, right? It's just processing numbers as it's been programmed to do. And that's kind of what people do when they're trying to solve math using their negative mind. They just memorize a series of steps, look at the format, and say, if I do this, this, and this is what will be the solution, is what I'm told, right? No, that's not the right way to learn math, and that's why a lot of kids have trouble with math in school, right? But before I get into that, because that's what I was going to talk about in terms of education theory, when you charge your subconscious properly, right, your perceptions alter to actually perceive the relationships in the proper way, right? You're not just memorizing a series of steps. You actually equate the math deeper, all right? And when that happened to me, it felt like I learned how to speak the language of math, right? Because I'm no longer using my negative mind to just memorize a series of steps to solve it, which I did in school, right? In high school and before. Now, when I had this experience, I understood math properly, right? Because I could perceive the relationships. And so if you put those equations in front of me now, even though I'm rusty, the same subconscious memory that held the charge for that transcendental intelligence, it'll switch to an active state, right? Because the same memory, subconscious memory associated with these experiences in math, right? And well, I don't think we've talked about the tools necessary to talk about how that works, because you might say, well, is there a subject associated with any random math equation? There is. We haven't talked about that stuff yet. We're going to talk about it in a little bit and in chapter 13. But for now, just know that there's a subconscious memory that as soon as I start doing some math like that, let's say you ask me to solve some vector calculus equation, right? The subconscious memory is associated with those equations, which, I charged years ago. I charged transcendental intelligence while focused on years ago. Those same memories are still in my long-term memory, and they'll switch to an active state the moment I focus on them or you put a problem in front of me. And that transcendental intelligence will still help me with the problem, right? So in other words, it's more, excuse me. So in other words, it's more than just memorizing steps in a negative-minded way that's related to your brain just saying, oh, here's a memory. You know what I mean? That's it's going to be easy. It's going to be easier for reasons that go beyond that, right? It's easier for me to solve that problem even after all these years while I'm still rusty, because my long-term memory still contains a charge related to transcendental intelligence. And so the reason that's so important for learning, and this is going to get into education theory, is I feel like in school, when a lot of kids have trouble with math, and I kind of relate to it because I didn't know math that well when I was in school, then I learned math very well. So ever since that, I always felt like when I was in school, right, and I would think the teacher wasn't explaining the math that well, and I didn't really make sense of it, or even if I took a word problem that I thought I got the answer wrong for, I would sometimes think it wasn't my fault, but I would think, no, the teacher's always right. When I got older, I learned that absolutely wasn't true, right? There are plenty of times the teacher's either completely wrong, right, or the math problem is worded wrong. If you learn math, right, when you learn math the proper way, right, you learn exactly kind of what I told you in the other video about the importance of definitions, right? If you word a math problem a certain way, there could be many different ways to interpret it. There's no one way to interpret it. It's on the person who presented you with the math problem to give you to word it in such a way that makes it correct. And in mathematical logic or in mathematical philosophy, there are certain ways they word words. They word a problem to ensure that you interpret it the correct way. They just don't always do that when you're in grade school, right? or even middle school or high school. They don't word it in the proper way they're supposed to. Like mathematics, the real math that you learn in college, they actually have almost like a nomenclature, similar to nomenclature you would hear in chemistry, or the nomenclature you would hear in medical science, right? Mathematics has a very similar nomenclature, which is used to make it very specific so you interpret the problems or word problems in the correct way, right? Now in school, they don't do that, and so you can interpret it many different ways. And then when you interpret it in a different way, they'll say you're wrong. Like, no, you were wrong. You worded the problem incorrectly. I've seen that many times when I look at kids' problems. But kids don't really know math on that level to know that the teacher is wrong or whoever worded the problem. Math has a very precise system to avoid that type of misunderstanding. And they just don't do that in school, right? And they get away with it because the kids aren't mature enough to know what's happening. So I've always been annoyed by that. When I got older and I realized what was happening, I realized they were completely wrong. And when I look at just kids' problems today, I see it all the time. Not all the time, because I don't look at them all the time. But I've seen it enough times, right, to know that it's still going on. But my point is, though, is that kids, in education, there's a very specific way to understand these problems and to do the math. And what kids have to do is they have to go through the same experience, basically the same experience that I did. It's almost like a intellectual boot camp, because you're never going to understand the math, because math is a series of relationships, right? Our brain doesn't charge our subconscious in its ground state in a way that makes it easy to perceive those kinds of relationships. You can only get it through transcendental intelligence, which you'll only get from charging your subconscious to have it. And you'll only get that if you continuously solve math problems and try to understand it on your own, right? That's why I don't know if I mentioned it before, no one could technically teach you math. That just isn't how it works, because there's nothing I can do to explain math into you in a way where you're going to be able, your perceptions can become altered to perceive relationships. Of course, I can just give you information. I could give a computer information, right? That doesn't mean it can solve a problem or it's going to understand a problem. The computer can solve it if I give it an algorithm, a series of steps to take this. Let's say you're solving a problem related to a wave. So a wave has an amplitude, and has a frequency or a period, right? Sometimes it'll even have a phase angle, right? Now, if you take an equation, let's say you want to solve what value is the amplitude at when the frequency is at 3 pi over 2 or something random like that, right? You can get a computer to just go through an algorithm that takes the number that would represent the amplitude, the number that would represent the frequency, right? And it can calculate these values, right? And pi is a constant. So the human mind can do the same exact thing, that's no problem, but it doesn't actually perceive these relationships more deeply because it hasn't charged it. Your subconscious hasn't charged and altered your perception to do that, right? And that's what kids do all the time. They're just using their negative mind to memorize these steps, and the equation in the math doesn't actually make sense to them, right? And it'll never make sense to you. No one can explain it to you. There's nothing a person can say to give you that altered state of perception. You just have to charge it, right? It's the only way you'll ever get it, right? But when you do charge it, right, which will happen if you kind of do what I did and just keep solving these problems, keep asking yourself questions, keep trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense to you. But when you do, and you'll keep producing intention in the process of doing that. And when you do, your subconscious will finally charge. In chapter 13, it's called organizing, which we'll talk about later. But it'll finally charge in a way that gives you that altered perception to perceive the relationships involved in math, right? And when you have that, you basically keep it for life, right? So even if when that charge is supercharged, right, or it's very intense, then you're going to be in the zone. But even if it's not, doesn't have all that charge years later, for example, and you're not in the zone with it, it's still better than not having it at all. That tiny little bit of energy that stays in your long-term memory will always be there to help you perform way better than you could before. So kids need to go through that sort of intellectual boot camp when it comes to math. At least math. I never needed to do it for any other subject. But they need to do it for math, and that's how they're going to understand math. So I feel like in school, they don't understand this principle, right? So I've never studied education theory. I could be wrong, but when I look at what's going on in school, and I remember what happened in school for me, it seems very clear to me that they're not applying these principles at all. And so, yeah, so that kind of went off in a tangent, but this is just something I've thought about. I think about all types of things related to subconscious energy mechanics. We haven't talked about a lot of them, but there are just some topics which I kind of, for some reason, have thought a lot about. This has been one of them, right? I feel that in school, they need to acknowledge these principles of how the mind works, right? In school, they always think this nonsense about how the mind is purely a material thing, right? And they think that that the idea that the mind is solely a material substance, right? It is the result of the interaction of matter, right? Chemicals in your brain, right? First of all, to me, that's always been absurd. Even when I was a kid, I didn't believe that. I thought that made no sense at all. But some people think that that's science. That isn't science. There's absolutely no evidence of that. It's like I said, to me, it's always been a nonsense argument, right? But there's no evidence that they use the term emergence, right? That consciousness is a result of something that emerges from the interactions of neurons in your brain. But there's no evidence. There's no, what experiment would you even use to demonstrate that? That's just a faith-based answer. That's an answer that results from having faith in materialist beliefs, right? There's no science involved in that whatsoever, right? Like, people keep thinking that's science. It's not, right? Prove it, right? It's never been proven. That's actually called the hard problem of consciousness in philosophy. There's no science involved in that at all. That's just the faith. That's pure faith, right? And so, and that's so that they keep studying or thinking about learning and the process of learning purely in terms of faith in materialism, right? And they don't understand they don't recognize and apply the metaphysical principles involved, which is what we're talking about, right? And so I just wish they kind of would, and they would acknowledge some of these ideas, right? And I think it would help children and kids and even people in college learn much better and more easily. But anyway, I went off a tangent, like I said. But that's why long-term memory is important for learning. So, and not just in school, right? Let's say, like when I was younger, I didn't know how to talk to girls at all, right? For a very long time, right? But when I got older, I just started practicing talking to chicks. That's actually where I learned a lot of these concepts from, because I kept trying to basically stimulate them emotionally, right? So remember what we said, a person's entertained when their subconscious charges during some activity or when they feel more emotion. So as I talked to chicks, I learned that the key was to emotionally stimulate them, right? There's almost no way they can't be attracted to you if they're not stimulated by you emotionally, because when they focus on you, the subconscious memory associated with you switches to an active state and they feel a lot of positive emotion. They're going to want more of that, right? And so, and sometimes you could say, well, if you're a bad boy type, which I never was, right, you could say that the subconscious memory will have negative memory. That's true, right? That usually happens when they're when a girl is in a relationship over a long time with the bad boy type. But in the beginning, when the situation is new, the danger frequency kind of overpowers that. And so they get attracted to the danger frequency. And then subconscious entropy happens. It completely suppresses the danger frequency. Now it's just a lot of negative frequencies that are just being charged. The danger frequency is still there a little bit. There's a lot of negative frequencies. And that's why girls usually grow out of that, right? And they look for a new situation to do it again because there's no subconscious memory. And the danger emotion comes in more strongly again. However, what I learned is that the key was to emotionally stimulate them. And so eventually I got super nice with it and I started getting in the zone. I would be hitting on girls all day, right? You could put a new girl in front of me I never spoke to and I would start hitting on her and talking to her and things like that. Now, I haven't done that in a long time, right? So I'm very rusty, but some of those skills have still remained with me, right? So in other words, long-term memory is very good for learning, right? Because those skills will remain with you pretty much for the rest of your life. And you could probably think of things you haven't done in years, right? That if you do it again, excuse me, my camera cut off. So like I was saying, you could probably think of something that you haven't done in years, right? And when you get in that situation again later, when you're just kind of thrown into a situation that you used to use those skills for, you'll notice some of those skills come back. And they come back in a way that is related to the transcendental level of performance you reached previously. Again, it'll make a little more sense because you might still think, well, that's similar to just your regular memory, but it isn't, right? And it'll make a little more sense when we talk about this more in chapter 13. But just as an example, is I remember when I used to talk to chicks all the time, right? Like I said, that's actually how I learned a lot of these principles, right? That was the beginning of it. I even talk about that a little bit in the book. When I would talk to girls all the time, right, I would never really be that successful in what I was doing until I would enter the zone, right? And it was only when I was in the zone, right, that I would get all these skills, right? And that's because my subconscious organized, which we'll talk about later. And so that skill is what remained with me for years. Memory alone is not able to contain the information that you get when your subconscious organized, which is why I could never do it until I had charged my subconscious to enter the zone. But anyway, I went on a little bit of a tangent. So going over this next point, we're now going to talk about short-term memory, right? So now long-term memory doesn't have any energy because all of the passive memories in long-term memory are aged out already, right? So they don't contain any significant energy until you focus on the subject associated with those memories. And even then, it doesn't have a lot of energy. Short-term memory is completely different, right? It has all the energy of your subconscious. So anytime you feel some kind of way in your mood, right, that's coming from some subconscious memory in your short-term memory. Your short-term memory is like your battery, right? That's your subconscious mind's battery pack, right? It contains all the energy. It has all the energy. And so the reason short-term memory is so important as it relates to charging is because of what we said. So remember what I said, your mood can boost or it can actually dampen. So depending on the frequency you're trying to charge, right, your mood can boost your ability to charge your subconscious. And so I think the example I give in the book is electrochemical battery, right? So if you think about charges, right, charged particles, which, there's a positive charge and negative charge, right? So like charges repel, repel, and opposite charges attract, right? Now, if you put a whole bunch of charged particles in a small area, right, what's going to happen? If they have a like charge, they're just going to start repelling each other, right? But even, to go forward with the example, you put a whole bunch of like charges in a small area, they'll repel each other. And as you stuff more and more and more charges in that area, they repel each other more and more and more. But what's happening more specifically is a subconscious field is forming, right? A subconscious field. We actually talked about what that is in chapter 15. Chapter 1 of the second book. But an electric field is what I meant to say. So as you stuff more and more charges in a small area, right, electric field forms. And that electric field gets stronger and stronger and stronger as there's more charges there. Now, if you put oppositely charged particle, right, so let's say it's a negative charge, that negative charge experiences a very intense attraction force in that electric field. If you put a positive charge in that field, it's going to experience a very intense repulsion force. So the more charges you stuff in that area, like charges, the stronger the electromagnetic field, right? And then the charge of the particle that enters that field, that will determine how it responds to that force of the field. Now, your subconscious is kind of similar, right? Because your subconscious short-term memory is like your subconscious mind's battery. Now, with that battery, right, if you put a whole bunch of subconscious memories, which is everything basically you've been thinking about, it's going to contain all these subjects or experiences you've had in the last 7 days, right? So they have the most amount of charge or energy in them. If you keep putting them in that subconscious memory, right, they're going to contribute, the energy they contain is going to contribute to your mood, right? And so any charge you try to produce, as a result of having that mood, is going to be strongly impacted by it, right? So if I put all my positive memories in my short-term memory, let's say they're all charged up at the fun frequency, right? Which is just a feeling you have when you feel like you're having a lot of fun, right? So remember, positive memory contains energy and contains a frequency, right? So negative memory doesn't contain any energy, and ostensibly it doesn't really contain a frequency, but in theory, the frequency would just be the ground state frequency of your body. Now, but positive memory contains a frequency. If you can stuff a whole bunch of subconscious memories in your short-term memory at the fun frequency, what's going to happen? All of their energy is going to add to each other, just like all of the particles you stuffed in a small space add to the electric field strength, but all of these subconscious memories, the energy in subconscious memories in your short-term memory will add to each other and boost your ability to charge the fun frequency later. Which means, what that really means, so that's a very algebraic way of saying it, but what that means in layman's terms, in terms of experience, is that if you're in a really fun mood, right, you're going to notice your ability to have fun is even easier than normal, right? So you're going to have a much easier time having fun, even with little things that normally wouldn't be very fun to you, right? And you've probably experienced this when you've hung out with friends before. So if you hung out with friends and you're having a really good time and you just feel like you're having a lot of fun, little tiny stupid things seem even more fun, right? Like they're for some reason fun. Like, when I was a kid and would hang out with friends, like, we didn't have, phones and, iPads or tablets, and internet barely even came out when I was a kid, right? That's how old I am. So we hung out a lot and went outside a lot. And so if we're hanging out, we could do something stupid like just decide to play Dipsy Doorbell, right? So Dipsy, I don't know if everyone called it that. It's obviously, I shouldn't say obvious, but it's when you basically knock on someone's door, ring their bell, and run away, right? Now, why would that be fun? Who cares, right? But, if you're having a lot of fun, little tiny things like that can be fun, right? I remember when I was a kid, hanging out with friends, during winter, they would throw ice at like buses or snowballs at buses going by, right? It's just little tiny things like that. But, if you're not charged up at the fun frequency, you might have a little harder time enjoying stuff like that, right? And so fun, the more your mood goes in one direction or one frequency, the easier it is to sort of charge energy related to that frequency into experiences, because that mood is boosting your charge. So that's actually very important, right? So that gets into another concept that I call deep charging, right? So deep charging is really important. I actually didn't go over this point. Let me just read it off. But short-term memory is important for reaching higher levels of charging intensity. Using short-term memory to boost your charge is called deep charging, right? So deep charging is a term that I've created, right? And what it means is charging your subconscious by specifically configuring your short-term memory in such a way that it gives you like more and more and more of a boost of the regular charge. Right now, we haven't talked about that yet. We'll talk about it in next chapter, because there's a regular charge and then there's something called deep charging, right? So this is very important because you cannot reach the higher levels of charging without deep charging. You have to deep charge, right? And the reason is because your passive memory, no matter how much charging you do, your passive memory, it's always going to go into your passive memory, your short-term memory, right? That's the part of your subconscious memory that contains all the energy. So if any type of charging you do, ostensibly will have energy, right? So that means it's going to be in your short-term memory. So the more charge you put in your short-term memory, right, the more it's going to impact your mood once those memories go to a passive state, and the more it's going to boost your charge later. So it's almost like mean value theorem in calculus. I know this is a very weird way of putting it, but mean value theorem, which I've always remembered, hopefully I'm not misremembering it and going to say it inaccurately, but mean value theorem basically says if you travel in a continuous way or on a continuous path, which just means there's no continuities, right? The rate of change, if your rate of change was A at one point and then your rate of change was B at another point, it means that for any number in between A and B, you would have had that derivative or that rate of change at some point along the path between A and B, right? Between the points where your rate of change was A and your rate of change was B. I think I said it a little bit accurately, but what I'm meaning to say is that if there's a path, right, if your rate of change at point A is, let's just say, derivative of A, right? And your rate of change at point B is derivative of B, right? There's going to be some number, let's C, in between A and B. We'll just call it derivative of C. Derivative of C that has a value in between the derivative of A and the derivative of B is what I meant to say, right? But what it means is that if the simplest sense is if you're going from, let's say, 0 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour, right, in a continuous path, at some point you had to have reached 16 miles an hour or 15. I could pick any number in between, and you had to have reached that number at some point while you're traveling. Your speed had to reach that number, or your velocity, right? So now I say that to say your subconscious mind is very similar in the sense that you cannot reach a higher level of charge without going through short-term memory first and boosting, using your short-term memory as a boost. And so that's why deep charging is very, very important. It's important to understand that because you can't reach the higher levels of charge without deep charging. We'll talk more about deep charging in the next chapter, chapter 11, which we've covered most of it, but there's still a little bit more to talk about with it. But yeah, so when you're trying to reach higher levels of charge, you're going to start learning how to actually manipulate your own short-term memory to ensure that it boosts properly. Now, just one other clarification I want to say, because we're almost done. I think this was a long video, but we're almost done. But one clarification I want to make is that I said if you stuff more and more positive memories into your short-term memory, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter how many memories there are. Just like an electric field, it doesn't matter how many particles electric field's a little different. It does matter how many particles you put there, because ostensibly each particle is going to have virtually the same amount of charge. But in short-term memory, right, it doesn't matter how many memories are there. What matters is how intense the charge of those memories are. If it's one memory that has all the charge that's contributing to your mood, that's the only one that's going to significantly matter. If it's 10 memories that have a charge, then it's going to be only those 10 that significantly matter. All that matters is how intense the charge is in your short-term memory and at what frequency. So if you're in a very good mood, or if you have a charge at a positive frequency, it's going to be very hard to charge negative energy because your mood is dampening a negative charge. So that's what you want anyway. One last thing I wanted to say is just to go back. I think I said it already, but I'll say it again. We spoke about how, before I said most people sort of perceive their own emotions and the mechanics of their emotions through the tiny little window of when something is new to them, right? Because there's no negative memory. Now, and I said that that's the exception to the rule. That's not the rule, right? So they can generally reach high levels of emotion when something's new, but when it isn't new anymore and they've had a lot of experience with it, subconscious entropy happens, and it's very difficult to experience a lot of emotion from that thing that's now old because of all the negative memory that's developed. And it's suppressing your ability to enter a transcendental state. Now, this deep charging principle is how you would reach a lot of charge or a lot of emotion outside of the experience when something's new to you. This is something most people do not understand, right? This is something most people do not understand, right? They're used to just experiencing something and feeling a lot of emotion with no real effort, right? You can only do that when something's new. When something is old, which is not the exception, this is actually the rule to your emotions, right? Is this: you have to adjust your short-term memory and keep using it you have to keep storing positive memory in it at a particular frequency to boost your charge more and more and more. That's the actual rule of how your emotions work. Most people don't know how to experience intense emotion relative to some subject or some activity after it's old because they don't know what the actual rule for their emotions are. They're just living according to that tiny little exception that only applies to a very short time, you know what I mean, in your experience with something, right? So most people, when something gets old to them, they just don't know anymore how to have a wonderful experience or feel a lot of emotions for it after it gets old. They're just kind of stuck that way forever. And that's very bad because there are things we can't just jump to new, like I said before, we can't just jump to new things endlessly, right? And some people try that when they're in a relationship. They just jump to a new relationship over and over and over and over again to keep experiencing the easiness of charging when something's new. But if you're in a relationship a long time, you can use this principle to feel wonderful emotions in your relationship, A lot of people don't know how to do that. Or if you're in a job, right, and you're in a job, once the job gets old, right, it gets very boring and it's the same thing over and over. But if you learn how to charge your energy, which you can do for your job if you want, but when I've done it, what I do is I charge my subconscious, if I have freedom, because I'm always using my subconscious to something, and I don't have the ability to charge other things because I'm charging for that one thing. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about the attention principle. We'll talk about that again next chapter. Yeah, I think it's next chapter. But, I usually use my subconscious to charge. I charge my subconscious for personality, right? I'll pick some personality trait and I'll just charge it, and I'll walk around with that trait and I'm not bored because my subconscious is charged at a frequency related to the job. We'll talk a little more about that in chapter 13 because that's related to performance. It's basically the same method that method actors use to kind of impact their personality. We're going to learn the mechanics of how that actually works on the subconscious level. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think this video was really long. Right, but yeah, I think I should have probably broken it up, but yeah, there was a lot to say. But yeah, we're pretty much done. In the next video, I'm going to talk about what happens when your short-term memory fills up with a lot of negative memory, because we've been looking mainly at passive memory in terms of positive memory. So we're actually going to look at what happens in terms of passive memory that's negative, right? And it's just your subconscious short-term memory is filled with negative memory, right? Which that can happen too. And then I think, we have to talk about one more thing, which is related to almost like a geometrical principle associated with the subconscious, which, believe it or not, there is actually geometry involved in subconscious mind, which we're going to talk a little bit about in this chapter. We're going to talk a lot more about in chapter 13. So yeah, that's it for now, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.